For 7 years, my family believed I worked as a mid-level project coordinator at a marketing firm, barely scraping by the family's designated disappointment compared to my sister's glamorous career in finance. That's exactly what I let them believe. At her wedding reception, seated at a table near the back with the extended family and plus ones, my mother introduced me to a stranger sitting beside me as Rachel, my other daughter. She does something with spreadsheets, I think. I smiled, said nothing, and let the moment pass. Because in exactly 11 minutes the best man was going to stand up, tap his glass, and accidentally reveal something to 300 wedding guests that my own family had no idea about, something that was about to make my mother's spreadsheet comment the most embarrassing thing she'd said in years. By the end of that reception, nobody at that wedding would ever call me a disappointment again. Stick around, because what happens in the next 10 minutes of this story is the part nobody saw coming. Let's get into it. My name is Rachel. I'm 34. I want to take you back 7 years to the actual origin of the secret I'd been carrying, because understanding exactly how it started explains everything about why my family had absolutely no idea who I'd become by the time my sister got married. At 27, I left a comfortable, unremarkable job in corporate marketing to co-found a software company with 2 former colleagues, a decision my family, when I told them, treated with a mixture of concern and thinly veiled disappointment. My mother in particular had strong opinions about the recklessness of leaving a stable job to chase what she described more than once as a fantasy. I want to be honest about the actual early years of that company, because they were genuinely difficult in ways that ironically made my family's skepticism feel almost justified for a while. We nearly ran out of funding twice. I worked 80-hour weeks for the better part of 3 years, living well below what my old corporate salary would have provided, quietly, deliberately choosing not to share the actual precariousness or ambition of what I was building with a family that had already made clear their doubts. Somewhere around year 4, our company, a workflow automation platform for mid-sized logistics companies, found genuine traction, landing several major clients that transformed our trajectory almost overnight. By year 6, we'd grown to just over 200 employees, and I'd become CEO following my co-founder's decision to step back into a purely technical role, a transition that came with genuine, substantial financial success. A position with equity now valued following a recent funding round at just over $38 million on paper, along with a role that had me regularly meeting with investors, being profiled briefly in 2 industry publications, and building something that by any reasonable measure represented significant, undeniable success. I told my family almost none of this in any real detail. I want to explain exactly why, because it's central to understanding this entire story. I want to walk through the specific reasoning behind 7 years of genuine, deliberate secrecy, because I think it's easy from the outside to assume this was simply about building towards some dramatic reveal, when the actual motivation was considerably more complicated and honestly more painful than that. My family, and my mother in particular, had a long-established pattern of comparing me unfavorably to my younger sister Melissa throughout our entire childhood and into adulthood. Melissa pursued a career in investment banking, landing a prestigious position at a well-known firm straight out of business school, and from that point forward, family conversations consistently cantered her trajectory as the standard against which my own considerably less conventional path was measured, and invariably found wanting. When I initially left my stable marketing job to co-found my company, the framing from my family solidified quickly into something I found genuinely difficult to continue fighting against directly. I was the daughter who'd made an impulsive, risky decision, while Melissa represented stability, ambition, executed correctly, the kind of success our family understood and valued. I made a decision somewhere around year 2 of the company's difficult early period that I simply wasn't going to keep fighting for my family's validation or understanding of a path they'd already decided to view skeptically. I began deliberately giving vague, minimal answers about my work during family gatherings, describing myself when pressed in intentionally modest, unclear terms that didn't invite further scrutiny or comparison, essentially allowing the family's existing assumption of my relative lack of success to persist unchallenged, rather than continuing to advocate for a more accurate picture they seemed at each juncture uninterested in fully engaging with anyway. I want to be honest that this decision came with real ongoing cost. Family gatherings over those 7 years consistently involved moments of quiet condescension, comments about needing to figure things out, gentle suggestions that I consider returning to something more stable. A general dynamic where my actual accomplishments growing more significant by the year remained entirely invisible to the people whose validation, on some level, I still genuinely wanted even as I'd stopped actively pursuing it. I want to walk through the roughly 14 months of Melissa's engagement and wedding planning because the specific dynamics of that period set up much of what eventually unfolded at the wedding itself. Melissa got engaged to David, a colleague from her firm, in a proposal that generated considerable enthusiastic family celebration, genuinely warranted since Melissa and David are by all accounts a genuinely well-matched happy couple. And I want to be clear throughout this story that my complicated feelings about my family's treatment of me never extended to any resentment toward Melissa herself, who I've always maintained a genuinely warm, uncomplicated relationship with, largely because she'd never actively participated in the specific pattern of comparison our parents maintained. During the wedding planning process itself, my role settled into a fairly predictable pattern, given the established family dynamic, helpful where needed, but consistently positioned somewhat peripherally compared to how central certain other family members and friends more aligned with Melissa's finance world social circle became to the planning process. My mother in particular spent considerable energy during this period discussing the impressive guest list, the various successful accomplished friends and colleagues of Melissa and David's, who would be attending, occasionally pointedly contrasting this with vague, mildly dismissive references to my own more modest professional circle. I want to describe one specific conversation from about 2 months before the wedding because it became directly relevant to what eventually happened at the reception. My mother, discussing seating arrangements, mentioned almost as an afterthought that she'd placed me at a table with the extended family and plus ones, rather than closer to the main family table, explaining, without much apparent awareness of how the comment landed, that she'd wanted the tables nearer the front, reserved for people David's business colleagues would find more interesting to talk to. I didn't push back on this seating decision, though I want to be honest, it stung considerably more than I let show in the moment. I'd grown accustomed over 7 years to simply absorbing these kinds of comments without correction, and I saw no particular reason to disrupt that pattern in the specific heightened emotional context of wedding planning. I want to walk through a detail that becomes absolutely central to everything that happens later in this story, one that neither I nor, importantly, my family had any awareness of until the reception itself. The best man at Melissa's wedding, David's closest friend from business school, turned out to have a direct, significant professional connection to me that nobody in my family had any way of knowing about. His name was James, and I want to explain exactly how our paths had crossed roughly 18 months before the wedding. James worked at a venture capital firm that had led the most recent significant funding round for my company, a deal that had involved extensive direct collaboration between the two of us over several months of negotiation and subsequent board involvement, given that James had taken a board observer seat following his firm's investment. I hadn't made any connection between David's best man and this James until roughly 3 weeks before the wedding, when Melissa mentioned his name in passing while discussing the wedding party, and something about the specific combination of his name and his firm's name registered with a jolt of surprised recognition as unmistakably the same person I'd been working closely with on my company's board. I want to be honest about the several days of genuine internal deliberation that followed this realization. I understood immediately that James's presence at the wedding created a significant, unpredictable risk to the careful, deliberate secrecy I'd maintained for 7 years. There was a real possibility, I understood clearly, that our shared professional connection might surface, in some way during the wedding itself, entirely outside my control. I considered briefly reaching out to James directly beforehand, asking him to keep our professional relationship private during the wedding, avoiding any risk of exactly the kind of public reveal that eventually occurred. I ultimately decided against this approach for reasons I want to explain honestly. Some part of me, after 7 years of consistent, deliberate self-effacement within my family, found myself genuinely curious, rather than purely anxious, about what might happen if the truth simply naturally emerged without any further active management or concealment on my part. I want to walk through the wedding day itself because the specific sequence of events leading up to the moment everything changed matters to fully understanding how it unfolded. The ceremony itself was beautiful, genuinely moving, Melissa radiant, David visibly emotional, the kind of wedding that reminds you why these rituals matter despite whatever complicated family dynamics might exist alongside the celebration itself. I found myself genuinely uncomplicatedly happy for my sister throughout the ceremony, any residual sting from the earlier seating conversation fading into the background of authentic joy for her. At the reception, I was seated as planned at the designated table with extended family, and plus one's a pleasant enough group, though noticeably separated from the more prominent tables near the head table where Melissa and David's closer friends and professional colleagues, including James, were seated. I want to describe the specific moment my mother made the comment I referenced in the hook of this story, because it happened almost exactly as I described it. Introducing me to an older cousin's plus one seated nearby, describing my work in the vague dismissive terms, something with spreadsheets. That had become over years her default characterization of a career she'd never taken the time to actually understand or ask meaningful questions about. I remember checking my watch shortly after that comment, aware that the toasts including James's best man speech were scheduled to begin within the next several minutes. I want to be honest that some part of me in that specific moment felt a distinct complicated anticipation about what might unfold, not quite hope, not quite dread, but a genuine uncertainty about whether the coincidence of James's presence would remain simply a private, unremarked fact, or whether it might surface in some unpredictable way during his speech. I want to walk through James's best man speech in careful detail, because the specific moment everything shifted happened almost entirely by accident in a way that neither James nor I had planned or anticipated in advance. James's speech began warmly, conventionally, stories about his friendship with David through business school, genuine warmth and humor about their years of friendship, the kind of speech that generated easy laughter and warmth throughout the room. About 4 minutes in, transitioning toward some closing remarks about David's character and work ethic, James made an offhand comment that I understood immediately with a kind of slow-motion clarity was about to change everything. He mentioned, in the context of praising David's professional network and connections, something about how impressive it was that David's circle included genuine industry leaders, offering as a specific example a brief admiring aside about watching one of the most impressive young CEOs I've worked with build a genuinely category-defining company over the past several years. Before adding, almost as a throwaway detail meant simply to add color to the anecdote, actually, small world, she's somewhere in this room today, if I'm not mistaken. Rachel, are you here? I want to describe the several seconds that followed as precisely as I can, because they remain among the most surreal moments of my adult life. The room understandably turned to search for whoever James was referring to, several guests visibly confused about which Rachel he meant, given the wedding included at least 2 other women with that name. My mother, seated near the front, looked around with obvious growing confusion, clearly not immediately connecting James's description to her own daughter. I raised my hand somewhat tentatively from my table near the back of the room and said simply, "That's me." I watched my mother's face from across the room shift through several rapid visible stages: initial confusion at the specific words CEO and industry leader being connected to me at all, followed by a kind of dawning disbelieving recalibration as she processed what James had just said, followed finally by an expression I don't think I'd ever quite seen on her face before. Genuine stunned uncertainty about a version of reality she'd apparently held with complete confidence for years, revealed in a matter of seconds to have been substantially, fundamentally wrong. James, apparently sensing from the room's reaction that he'd stumbled into something more significant than he'd initially realized, added a few additional genuinely admiring details, mentioning specifically the recent funding round, the company's growth trajectory, framing it with visible enthusiasm as exactly the kind of impressive industry-defining success that made David's professional network so genuinely remarkable. I want to walk through what happened in the minutes and following hour after that speech, because the reaction from different corners of that reception revealed genuinely different things about how various family members and guests had understood or misunderstood who I actually was. Several guests at nearby tables, people who'd known me only peripherally through the extended family network, approached me with genuine warm curiosity over the following 20 minutes, asking questions about the company, clearly recalibrating their entire understanding of who I was in real time. My mother approached me directly about 15 minutes after the speech concluded, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of genuine shock, something that looked almost like embarrassment, and underneath both of those a kind of confused hurt that I hadn't told her any of this directly herself before it emerged so publicly through someone else's speech. I want to be honest about the conversation that followed, because it wasn't the triumphant, satisfying confrontation you might expect from the framing of this story's title. My mother asked, quietly, genuinely bewildered, why I'd never told her, not accusatory in that first moment, but genuinely confused, processing 7 years of assumptions that had just been revealed as substantially incomplete. I told her honestly in that moment that I'd stopped sharing details about my actual career trajectory, somewhere around year 2 of building the company specifically because I'd grown tired of the consistent pattern of comparison, to Melissa the gentle dismissiveness about my choices, the general sense that whatever I shared would be received with skepticism rather than genuine interest or support. I watched my mother absorb this explanation with visible growing discomfort, understanding, I believe, for the first time with real clarity, the actual cost of a pattern she may not have even fully recognized herself as maintaining consistently over years. I want to describe Melissa's specific reaction to everything that unfolded because it differed meaningfully from my mother's and mattered enormously to me given how much I genuinely wanted to protect my relationship with her throughout this entire 7-year period of secrecy. Melissa found me shortly after my conversation with our mother, pulling me aside briefly during a natural lull in the reception, and her reaction was refreshingly almost entirely free of the complicated defensiveness that characterized my mother's response. She expressed genuine immediate excitement and pride, asking rapid, enthusiastic questions about the company, clearly delighted rather than destabilized by this new information about her sister. I want to be honest that Melissa did express some genuine gentle hurt of her own, not about the professional secrecy itself, which she seemed to intuitively understand, given everything she'd witnessed of our family dynamic over the years, but about the fact that I hadn't felt able to share this significant part of my life with her, specifically given how close our own relationship had generally remained despite the broader family pattern. I told her honestly that keeping the secret from the broader family had inevitably meant keeping it from her too, given how interconnected our family conversations were, and that I genuinely regretted that particular cost of my decision, even as I stood by the broader reasoning behind it. I want to walk through the roughly 10 months since that wedding because the shift in my family dynamic that followed has been genuine, if considerably more gradual and complicated than the dramatic reveal itself might suggest. My relationship with my mother has genuinely evolved since that day, though I want to be honest that it hasn't been a simple linear transformation into full validation and understanding. She's expressed in several conversations since the wedding genuine remorse about the pattern of comparison and dismissiveness that had characterized so much of how she'd related to my career over the years, acknowledging more directly than she ever had before that she'd allowed assumptions about my path to go largely unquestioned and unexamined for far too long. I've also noticed in the months since a meaningful shift in how family conversations unfold when my work comes up, genuine specific curiosity, now rather than the vague dismissive characterizations that had defined those interactions for years. I want to be honest that some complicated feelings remain on my part about the fact that this shift required an accidental public reveal rather than my family simply independently choosing to engage more genuinely with who I actually was and what I'd built, regardless of whether it fit their existing narrative about which daughter represented real success. I've done some real reflection in the months since about my own role in maintaining that secrecy for so long, understanding with more nuance now that my decision to withhold information, however understandable given the pattern, I was responding to also foreclosed opportunities for my family to potentially engage differently had I given them more genuine chances to do so along the way. If there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this. Sometimes the people closest to us build narratives about who we are that have far more to do with their own assumptions and comparisons than with the actual evolving truth of our lives, and sometimes those narratives persist for years simply because nobody, including us, ever fully interrupts them. I don't think keeping my success secret for 7 years was necessarily the healthiest or most strategic response to my family's pattern of comparison, and I've made real peace with the complicated mixed feelings I still carry about how that truth eventually emerged not through my own deliberate choice, but through an unplanned, almost accidental collision of circumstances at my sister's wedding. If you've ever found yourself minimizing your own accomplishments to avoid disrupting a family narrative that's already decided who you are, I hope this story reminds you that the narrative itself deserves to be questioned and that you're allowed to take up space as the actual full person you've become rather than the smaller, more comfortable version certain family members may have quietly, persistently decided to keep believing in. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments and subscribe for more real stories about family ambition and the moments when the truth finally undeniably surfaces. I've got plenty more where this